Today we're going to learn about the three basic economic questions. There are many different types of economic systems, and the way that we can categorize these economic systems is by taking all their decisions and bringing them down to three questions: what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. Because in economics, we want to satisfy the wants by using limited resources, and hence it's very important to know how exactly we're going to answer these three questions. Before moving on to the questions, let's look at two key stakeholders in economic system. One of them is the government and the other is the private sector. Now, as you all can understand, the government and the private sector has very different goals and very different motives, right? What does the private sector usually look for? The private sector usually looks for making profit, and we say that the private sector has a profit motive. So when you think of any of the decisions that the private sector makes, you always have to ask yourself, does this give you enough profit? Why would a private sector company or a firm do anything or make anything? The answer is to make profit. Whereas the government looks for welfare for its citizens, for its people, for its economy, and for the country. So if you ask yourself, why does the government do anything? Government does everything so that they benefit the people, they benefit the citizens, and for the general welfare of the people. So to ask yourself the question, what to produce, let's answer this question in two different perspectives. One from the perspective of the government, where the government actually wants to ensure welfare to its people, and the other from the perspective of a private sector, where they want to make profit. So if you think about it, what kinds of goods and services and commodities will bring welfare to the people? Those are the kinds of goods that the government is going to produce. For example, roads, bridges, infrastructure, right? These are the kind of goods and services that helps people, that helps transport, that helps businesses. Education, healthcare. These are the sorts of goods and services that the government would produce for the people. Also, so many other goods and services, for example, free food or housing to help the underprivileged people, right? So all of these bring out the welfare for the people around you, for the disadvantage for the people who doesn't have enough money. Whereas in the private sector, you only produce the goods and services that brings you a lot of profit. So for example, any of the things that are branded, right? For example, soda, branded cars, Audi, Lamborghini, Mercedes, and then anything that you can sell to get enough profit, any service, for example, hairdressing, for example, private banking. So all of these very personalized services that people buy with a lot of money can essentially give you a lot of profit. So when these two different stakeholders ask the same question, what to produce, the answer, as you can see, is very, very different. And hence it's important to ask these questions if you want to assess what kind of economic system are we studying about. What about the question, how to produce? Every good and service needs to be produced in a certain way, right? And of course, there can be different methods of production, there can be different resources used in the production. And this is also very different in the government as a stakeholder and is a private sector as the person who's producing the goods and services, right? So if you've noticed, what the government always tries to do is to ensure that in any production process, there's a lot of labor involved so that people have jobs, right? So in most of the production processes of the government, there will be labor-intensive production, which essentially means that most of the resources used in this production process is going to be labor, it's going to be human resource, it's going to give people jobs. Because if you give people jobs, that brings welfare to the society. If people have more jobs, there's going to be less unemployment. Also, what the government always tries to do in the production process is to make sure that there is minimum amount of pollution, right? So essentially what the government is going to do is to make sure that their production process is always ensuring that they recycle the waste that is coming out, that they're ensuring that they create the least amount of carbon dioxide emission in the production process. However, in contrast, if we look at the private sector, what kind of production process that they use? They use the production process that's going to make sure that they have the least cost, right? Because if they have the least cost, then their profit margin will be extremely high. And when they want to do this least cost production, they also have to ensure that their production process is extremely productive and it's extremely efficient. And when you want to do all of that, you really do not care about the environment. So what essentially happens is the creation of a lot of pollution. And also the private sector, what it essentially does is it employs a lot of machinery, it employs a lot of automation, because automation and machinery and technology essentially ensures that your production process is highly efficient and highly productive, so that you can get more profit in less amount of time. So their production process is actually the opposite. It's capital intensive production process, which means that you're essentially using capital or man-made assets, which are basically automation and technology, to ensure that your main production process and their entire production process is extremely efficient to earn profit. The third and the final question that these stakeholders ask is, for whom to produce? Who are we producing these goods and services for? Because it's actually extremely important to know exactly who you are producing who you are using the resources behind, right? So as a government, as we've already discussed when answering the question what to produce, if you can think about it, the government usually cares more about the people who are poor, about the people who are unprivileged, right? So people who are underprivileged and people who are poor, these are the kinds of people that the government usually produces for. And also for the mass public, right? For the mass public, the government doesn't necessarily make a lot of goods and services catered specifically or specialized for individual people. What it tries to do is to create goods and services that are extremely inclusive, that includes a lot of people and that benefits a lot of people, because that is essentially what gives the government a lot of welfare. However, what about the private sector? The private sector produces for people who has money, right? It produces for people who are rich, because essentially these are the people who can give the private sector something that they want, which is the profit, right? So that is one of the disadvantages of the private sector. It has a lot of inequality, because the people who are rich and the people who can pay the money are the ones that the private sector produces for, right? And now, as you can understand why these three questions are so important to answer, because now we can see the difference between a lot of decision making and a lot of resource allocation that is different between these stakeholders.